Hmm. Well, so let's see. What's the thing to focus on today? I would say this. Try and focus on your spine and the relationship between your spine and your lower body, right? So obviously your spine sprouts out of somewhere, down at the back of your pelvis, right? So start there, and whether you're sitting seiza or in a chair, see if you can, or cross-legged, see if you can find the ideal tilt and position for your pelvis such that your spine sprouts comfortably from your lower body in a way that feels completely relaxed and not either kinked or bowed or anything like that. Just really kind of natural. And you can do that by twisting your body right and left a little bit, moving your pelvis forward and backward, just seeing where it sits. And the other thing about it is related to that, this is not so much of a problem if you're sitting in a chair, but if you're sitting seiza or cross-legged, sometimes I actually have trouble with this. Sometimes you're if there are any asymmetries in your posture, they can cause a twist. So try and also center your upper body such that you really feel like you're mounted directly over evenly mounted directly over your lower body, right? That's all. And then once you've done that, to make your upper back sort of relaxed and upright. The main thing to do is to place a little bit of a lift in your chest, so your sternum were being lifted up a little bit, not extremely, but just a bit. And what happens there naturally, you might notice, is that it starts to feel like the skin and muscles in your upper back are sort of all of a sudden relax a bit and start falling towards the base of your spine. So that's the way to make it so that your back is, you can sustain sitting for a pretty long time without running into the usual trouble with backs. So often people have trouble with their lower back, but also the muscles in their upper back can start to hurt a lot. When I started out sitting, that was a huge problem for me. It'd be like I had a spot sort of just below my right shoulder blade that would just hurt excruciatingly after a while because because there was some tension in that muscle that I hadn't figured out how to address yet, basically. And then to top it off, literally, your head and neck. So if you lift your chest, lift your sternum in this way, that naturally moves your head and neck back a little bit, and then you want the crown of your head to be lifting towards the ceiling, right? And that naturally causes your face to drop into a vertical plane, your nose to be sort of up above your navel and your ears in line with your shoulders. And then the way to maintain that is kind of with the breath. So if you sort of breathe out in a concerted way, as though your breath were collapsing into your hara, into your lower abdomen on the out breath. You'll notice that that has an effect exactly on your spine. It kind of accentuates a little bit the posture that we've just put the spine in. And if on the in-breath you relax any tension in your lower abdomen and you allow your breath to just sort of come in at any way it wants and sort of climb up your back, you can notice that it kind of gives a little energy, a little extra energy to your back. All of this is to point out that your posture in Zazen is not static, it's dynamic. So let's sit for a bit. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's just sit for a while and then we'll figure out what to do next. We're pretty near the end of sitting. I thought I'd just say one thing, even though I said I wasn't. It's good while you're sitting to, when the opportunity arises, when your awareness returns to the body and to your broader experience, right? It can be useful to check in with your posture. And so since we focused on the back earlier on, right, to check in on what actually is the state of your back. Does it have its natural curves? Does it feel relaxed and energetic? Are some portions of your back feeling uncomfortable or grabbing for your attention in some way or another? Just to check in, and if you discover that something seems to have slipped out of alignment or there's some discomfort, first just pay attention to it. Don't do anything, just notice it. Just acknowledge it and experience it. And sometimes that's enough. And then sometimes it makes sense to deliberately, slowly, and carefully readjust your posture so that it has that quality of alertness and relaxation. And watch what happens next. So it's been a while since we did Kinhin or walking meditation. Maybe it'd be a good idea to try it out. So why doesn't everyone stand up and sort of stand behind where they were sitting, and we can walk around in a circle. We won't get very far because we're going to walk really slow, but let's just give it a try. Yeah. So stand with your knees unlocked, sort of your body relax, maybe shake it out a little bit. And then the upper body position is just about the same as when you're sitting zazen. So upright, relaxed. If you like, there's a hand mudra. You put your left thumb inside your left fist, put that here, and put your right palm on top of it like that, with your right thumb on top of the back of your left thumb. But it's okay if you don't want to do that. So everyone turn to your left. And then on the next out breath, move your left foot forward, just just slightly in front of your right foot. And as you breathe out, transfer your weight more and more to your left foot. And then as you breathe in, you can start to lift, not off the floor, but just up on the ball of the foot. Lift your right foot, and on the next out breath, plant it in front of your left. And then repeat. Whatever rate and depth of breath you're using is fine. People tend to breathe at different rates, so if you discover you're running up on somebody, just take shorter steps. That's all. Just like in Zazen, you keep your eyes open and your gaze downcast and wide. All right, that's probably good. Let's go back and sit down. So before, I was going to do a short talk about something, but before I do that, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff we just did or about practice in general? Really anything, but any general questions, specific questions, thoughts? complaints or comments? Well, this is what I was going to talk about. I've probably talked about some of this in other talks I've given here at the Olympics. So if it's a repeat for any of you, then I hope I can talk about it from a different angle. But basically, the fundamental question is, what is what is this Buddhism stuff good for, and why, right? And among other places, this question is addressed in a sutta in the Pali Canon in a really kind of marvelous way, right? But I thought I'd talk about it in a different light. Like, basically, as far back as we have records of what people were worried about, it seems like people were worried about people, about how much of a mess they made, about their failings and errors, their abuses of power, their abuses of each other, and so on. And this goes pretty far back, right? Like the earliest literatures of the world have a bunch of features, but a really persistent feature in them is this set of concerns, right? It's almost like some point in early history, right? In the early era of the historical record, but even before that, because basically a lot of the stuff that became the earliest literatures of the world was derived from previous oral traditions, right? So including things like the Odyssey and so on. So at some point, and nobody really knows when it is, I've thought a lot about this, like you can see in the material culture of at least some early societies that we've dug up and done a lot of analysis of, you can see changes over thousands of years in their material culture and so on that might indicate changes in the culture at large, right? But it doesn't really. None of this points to the question of when life became suffering for people. Right? But certainly by the time of the Buddha, everyone's pretty clear on this, that humans were a mess, and they made messes on their own, and they made messes with each other, and they made messes for each other, right? And sometimes those messes were small and limited in scope, and sometimes they were gigantic, right? The example, from ancient literature, the Trojan War, man, what a mess, and such an unnecessary waste of time and life, right? So horrible. And yet they did it, and they even wrote a long poem about it. At least someone wrote a long poem about it. Right? And so, I guess an example from Indian culture is the Bhagavad Gita, right? There's another horrible event with a poem about it. But anyway, so people started puzzling about this and asking themselves why, and also what we can do about it, right? And a lot of the schemes that they came up with initially all had to do with, I mean, certainly in the Odyssey, the explanation was we're at the mercy of these, nature spirits, basically, who don't necessarily have our interests at heart and are jealous and finicky and capricious, right? But after a while, that became less and less satisfactory. And so other people cooked up other solutions. And there was a big explosion of this stuff, in the last few centuries before the Common Era. And out of it came the yogic traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, and a bunch of other philosophical systems, including pre-Socratic philosophy and so on. And my sense is that the Buddhist proposition for why and how we could do, why it's like this and how we could do better was pretty unique, right? The proposition is that we're built like this, and that's why we behave in this way, right? But that it's possible to be free from it by living a certain way, which involves living according to moral precepts and essentially studying the activity of the self through meditation and through other, regular practices in order to wise up and continue wising up, basically. Right? Yeah, that's good. And then after a bunch of I would say cultural change or something like that. What arose is in particular Mahayana Buddhism, right? And the idea there, I think, this is probably just my opinion. I'm not sure if you got a room full of scholars together whether they think this is true or false. But my idea is mostly this about it: the way Buddhism was embedded in South Asian and Central Asian society initially was initially derived from the Indian sort of Shramanic tradition. So in order to be a Buddhist, you had to renounce society and live according to very strict principles that limited the scope of your activity and limited your interactions with other people in a really severe way, right? And that lines up with this cultural phenomenon that's been noticed by a lot of people, but in particular, the economist Thomas Piketty wrote a book about called something like Capital and Ideology that talks about ideological systems. And one of the things he notices, if you look structurally and historically at societies all over the world, often they have this this structure where you have essentially broadly three classes: the people that make things and grow food, the people that run the show and fight wars, and then there's a third class who are people that are taken care of by the other two and often have sort of a spiritual or shamanic function, right? But the main requirement for them is that they don't, one, they're renunciate, generally celibate, and like for example, in the Theravadan tradition, monks are not allowed really to do any work at all, right? They're taken out of in order to be in the position that they're in, they're taken out of pretty much all of the activities of this social and economic activities of the society, right? And I think increasingly that wasn't working for people, right? With respect to Buddhism, right? There were particularly, I think, more in Central Asia, but also especially when Buddhism started spreading to East Asia, Chinese culture in particular was like, nah, that's not really for us, right? If you have to totally withdraw from society and renounce your family and so on and so forth, and not do anything, that's not really going to work all that well for us. And so one of the functions of the Mahayana was that it opened at least the possibility to practice for a much broader swath of the culture, right? It still didn't go all the way, I would say, but it definitely changed things around. So by the time the Buddhism was really established, say in China, right? There were monasteries, and there were there were people that were living a at least somewhat renunciate life, but the boundary was way more permeable, right? So people were there. You have lots and lots of stories of people who worked as government officials and then would go off and do retreats and stuff like that, not unlike today, right? And there was a sort of stronger integration of a larger slice of society into Buddhist life, and in particular into the practice, right? And along with that, Mahayana Buddhism also kind of shifted the focus of the practice from, there was this idea, I think initially, that the key to relief from this suffering of being human was to gain knowledge about the mechanisms and structures and concepts that cause that suffering, and to learn the knowledge that in fact, for example, that we didn't really have a persistent, self-consistent self, right? and that and so on and so forth, and to really, to really learn it, to really study it and internalize it, and then you would be free, right? And increasingly in Mahayana Buddhism, and if you look at the literature that arose around it, there's this sort of deprecation of knowledge and wisdom as traditionally understood, right? And this focus on something else, some other kind of experiential quality that arises out of living in this way, and also in particular arises out of practicing meditation and practicing, mindfulness in the midst of everyday activity and so on, that that goes beyond knowledge and wisdom as it's traditionally put together, and offered, and is the key to that relief. And that's certainly the thing that that Zen as a Mahayana school in China in the Tang Dynasty, and starting in the Tang Dynasty and really kind of gelling during the Song Dynasty. So that's essentially the 10th century. Really emphasized, right? And even though that was true, right? And even though in principle there were, celebrated lay people and so on and so forth in the Zen community, and they show up in the literature, and families that practice together and so on and so forth. Even with that, there was still this way in which the society was divided in this particular way, where essentially the vast majority of people were not practicing Zazen or studying this stuff at all, right? And the people that were mostly members of the imperial family or the administrative elite, and it was usually like, the family in the administrative class would have a few kids. The oldest kid would pass their social service exams and go into some administrative job, and the younger son the parents would be like, yeah, we don't really have enough money to launch you into an administrative career. Why don't you go off and be a monk? That's not exactly right, but I think that happened a fair amount, actually. So there was still this kind of division where the vast majority of people were not practicing, right? And that continued when Zen moved to Japan, right? You've got again, the vast majority of people, their only function was to support temples and the monks in them, and so on and so forth. And the only difference in Japan with Zen was that Zen was adopted kind of enthusiastically by the samurai class, because basically Zen jumped to Japan just about the time when the imperial government sort of fell out of favor, and there was a government by warlord for the next 500 years or something like that, right? So, and the warlords all kind of thought Zen seemed pretty cool, right? So they were doing it, right? But again, there kind of wasn't a critical mass, right? And so most people were still going around. The point of all this is that most people were still going around and making messes, right? And if you look at the history of Japan after the arrival of Zen Buddhism, you would not say that it was a comfortable, peaceful place to live for the most part for the next several hundred years, right? There was a lot of fighting and mass murdering and so on and so forth. So, and then eventually this stuff jumped to Europe, South America, the US, and so on, right? The Americas. Sort of starting in the, well, interesting. Like heritage Buddhists were in those countries for a pretty long time because they were there as immigrants, right? But that Buddhism had a flavor that was, wonderful, but a lot like the way it had been for the previous several hundred years, say in Japan, where there were a few people that were involved in monastic practice and everybody else was related to them in some way, but not practicing much. Right? And in fact, mostly saw the Zen priests when they had a funeral to go to or something like that. The interesting thing that happened when convert Buddhism started arising, like I was related to, I was essentially, I'm a sort of second generation convert Buddhist, right? My parents were practiced various forms of Buddhism in the 60s and 70s, and my mom in particular was a Zen student. Right? So, and what I remember is that there was never any question, but that everyone should be everybody who was involved in Buddhism should actually be practicing in the way that the monks do, although obviously not many of them wanted to go off and live in monasteries, right? And that was kind of a switch, right? And when I look at that, it makes me feel like maybe it's possible that people could that you could get a critical mass of people together that could practice in a way that was really kind of beneficial, right? That would be wonderful. Because my experience with the practice is that it really does relieve to a surprising degree the suffering and messiness of a human life. Right? It's not bad. It's got the saying earlier, like the focus in Zen practice is to bring up this sort of other mode of engagement or being that holds our experience in a way that doesn't involve so much judgment, grasping, aversion, calculation, and so on, and simply allows it to be itself, and then looks to see how to respond, looks carefully to see how to respond, and allows the responses to arise not out of our sort of conditioned and habitual mode, but more out of actual engagement with the energy and information that's alive in the moment. Right? Good. It works well. And it opens the door for living skillfully with the human, whatever version of the human condition you've got, and also leaves the door open for pretty transcendent experiences that show exactly how little we know about what it actually means to be human, or how little we normally know about what it actually means to be human. So, what time is it? Any questions about that? Well, then let's sit a little more. And then we can call it a night. Well, thanks so much for coming. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any books on Buddhist history that you recommend?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
I heard Richard Gong